this on? Can you hear me? Welcome to Soka University of America. My name is Mary Patrick Kavanaugh, and I program the Critical Conversations. And I want to thank you for coming tonight. Suicide is a difficult and complicated topic. I wanted to thank you all for coming, the brave, open-hearted, and courageous of you here. And I want you to help me thank the Orange County Register, who really worked with us to put the word out. Let's give them a round of applause. I'm very, very curious how many are here for the first time ever. Please clap, because I can't see you. Okay. So while we're waiting, I understand there's still some people who need to be seated. While we're waiting, I wanted an opportunity to introduce all of you, especially those of you who have not been to Soka before, to our university. So we're going to show a brief video. Thank you.
I'm from Arizona. Delhi, India.
Maui, Hawaii. New York City.
Malaysia.
Newark, California.
South Sudan.
Torrance, California.
We're a residential college, and we have students here from 40 different countries, as well as all over the United States. It's really an incredible environment to live in.
When you walk into the cafeteria, you will hear so many different languages. It's fun, and you feel like you've traveled the world.
People became friends, like a family. I think Soka is like a second home for me.
Being with so many different people also shows how common we are as human beings too. Like what are, not the differences, but the commonalities.
I was diagnosed with cerebral palsy at birth. The doctors basically told my parents I wasn't going to be able to walk or talk. Having to talk about my cerebral palsy again with a whole new group of people who don't know me, that was really scary. I was afraid of not really making friends. Soka is just such an awesome place full of such amazing, kind people. I had never really had that kind of support outside of my family from people I kind of just met. Disability is just another form of being diverse. It just opens people's eyes to another way of just being.
Confidence is definitely one of the big things I struggled with coming to SUA. And I felt that I was ill-equipped to give any retorts to some of the discussions that were happening or arguments. This all led to me just kind of like really degrading myself, my own like academic worth. The relationships that you foster with professors has been extremely beneficial for my growth. The constant discussions and dialogues that I would have with my friends outside of the class and inside the class as well were so instrumental in me like coming out of this shell. I definitely have transformed so much since my freshman year, and currently I'm the student body president.
I taught at a very large public institution in which I was giving lectures on stage. I didn't know the students' names. I didn't interact very much with them. So coming here was a drastic change and a change for the better.
The student to faculty ratio is 9-to-1, so learning is dynamic on this campus.
Here at Soka, each student studies a language, either French, Spanish, Japanese, or Chinese. And in their third year, it's a mandatory study abroad program where they can travel to a country that speaks that language.
Every class is so interactive because the professors are not just going to teach you. They're here to learn from you too. Your world just comes crashing down in the most fascinating way about when you learn from all these classes that you have to think differently and like you have to analyze it more.
I was born at one of the most remote villages in Nepal. We didn't have electricity, we didn't have roads. When I was in my 12th grade, both of my parents accidentally passed away in the same year. It was very hard for me to tolerate the situation, but I thought I had to keep going. I came back to my village again from the district headquarters and started building schools for the poor. Without Soka, I wouldn't be able to go to a college. Now I'm trying to replicate the model and build more schools. Definitely, I would really want to make a bigger difference in the world.
Students' academic achievement is important, but equally important is the students' ability to connect to the mission of Soka and to demonstrate that they are committed to becoming a global citizen.
I feel everybody here has that same feeling of making the world a better place, and no matter what job or career we go into.
This culture of care is so intrinsic to SUA that by the time you leave, you can't help but just care about people. We don't have classes to tell you like, okay, now today we're gonna learn how to become global citizens. I think that culture just flows on campus.
It's like a safe haven where the world can meet.
Thank you. So last summer, it was actually about a year ago when we started programming this academic year, the programs for critical conversation. And we knew we wanted to embrace the topic of mental health, and we knew we wanted to bring Dr. Kay Redfield Jamison to campus. And then suddenly there was just this string of suicides in the headlines. There were the celebrity headlines, there was Anthony Bourdain and Kate Spade, and then our school district in Rancho Cucamonga had 4 kids over a period of 2 weeks, supposedly unrelated. And it just seemed urgent that we dive deep and embrace the topic of suicide, though it is scary. It was scary for us to call an event or put the word suicide in the title of an event. At the beginning of all of these events, I always talk about what the intention of critical conversations is, which is to ignite conversations and ideas that we hope these conversations will spread to boardrooms, classrooms, living rooms all over the county. But in this case, our intent is larger. It is really to hold ourselves as a community, figuratively, literally, hold each other up as we face some of these great tragedies. And because we are a community internally and externally, we have invited our great friend and the mayor of Aliso, Viejo, to welcome you all to the event tonight. Let's bring him up. Ross Chun.
Thank you, and good evening, friends and neighbors. And thank you for joining us in this beautiful venue. As Mary Patrick mentioned, I'm Ross Chun. I'm the mayor here in Aliso Viejo. But I'm a resident here. I'm a husband. I'm a parent of 2 wonderful children. And we've lived in this community for almost 20 years. I was here for the groundbreaking and the ribbon cutting for this university. I've served on a number of boards and commissions that support community activity and recreation. I've enjoyed living here and benefiting from all of the beauty that you see around us. During this time, my family and I have seen our city grow, and we've enjoyed what many would consider to be an enviable lifestyle here in South Orange County. But I've also seen an alarming trend that impacts individuals, families, and most recently our children. Tragedy has impacted our city many times in recent years in the way of suicide, and has taken the lives of adults and children right here in our community. As a community member, as an elected government official, and as a parent in our schools, sadly, I've attended a number of candlelight vigils for young students who've chosen to take their own lives. And I've talked with their classmates, and I've heard the astonishment in their voices when they say, "I just saw her last week and she seemed fine." Or, "I'm in a class with him every day and I never thought there was anything wrong." Mental health is quickly becoming a critical topic of discussion among families and in our schools. And as I said, the alarming trend has impacted our community, and it has directly impacted my family with an incident that some of you may be aware of at Don Juan Avila Middle School, where my son attends. This issue has become very personal to me, and the discussions are not coming fast enough. I've learned through support groups and counseling sessions that many, many of my friends and neighbors are also struggling with these concerns, and not just because they saw what happened at our school recently and in our schools over the last 5 years, but because their own children are suffering from anxiety, from depression, from OCD. The public must become aware of how close to home these incidents can strike, and the stigma about mental health must be lifted. I believe that this can be accomplished effectively by events like this, and with the participation from the community and the speakers like we have here this evening. I want to thank Soka University for bringing Dr. Kay Redfield Jamison and Allison Maehlman to speak with us this evening. And I want to thank everyone here and invite you all to take part in this critical conversation. Thank you very much.
Okay, before I introduce our first speaker, Allison Maehlman, I want to acknowledge that this topic can trigger a lot of strong emotions. So if for any reason you're uncomfortable at all, obviously you can get up and leave the hall. We do have 7 different community health organizations in the lobby right now. And they're going to stay staffed throughout the event if you want to get some more information or resources. We have the Depression and Bipolar Support Alliance, the Living Success Center from Costa Mesa, the Wellness Center South in Lake Forest, the Radiant Health Centers in Irvine, D.D. Hirsch Center from Santa Ana, the With Hope Amber Craig Memorial Foundation, and we have survivor, author, speaker Christy Hugstad. So you're welcome to wander out there and speak to them at any time. Also, we do have a small black box theater right above our campus, right above our Performing Arts Center here, and if you want to go watch it in a smaller venue with perhaps more privacy, just ask any usher. Finally, tomorrow we will be posting a link on Facebook of this event recorded, so if you want to watch it tomorrow at home, you can do that as well. The sequence of events tonight, we're going to have Allison Maehlman up shortly, and then Kay Redfield Jamison will come and speak. And following that, we have 4 microphones set up in the hall for all of you to join the conversation and ask questions. They're 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then we will take a break. Okay. I have to take a deep breath. Maybe we should all take a deep breath. Huh? Okay. I'm so excited to introduce Allison Maehlman, the founder and executive director of Active Minds. Active Minds is a national nonprofit organization that supports mental health awareness and education for students. Allison's going to be sharing her story in great detail, but she's extraordinary in how she transformed her grief over the suicide death of her brother Brian into a life dedicated to helping young people create resources for one another. My other hat at Soka University is I direct the Bridges to Business program, which helps our Soka students who are interested in business connect that education into the business world. And Allison Maehlman is exactly the kind of role model and entrepreneur that I would want to expose them to on a regular basis. She created Active Minds in 2003 when she was only 21 years old. She had just finished her undergraduate education, and she was determined at that time to change the culture of silence and shame that prevented people like her brother from getting help. So she created her own student-to-student model. Its number 1 goal was to spread the word that seeking help is a sign of strength and not something to be ashamed of. Active Minds is now on more than 600 campuses. It reaches almost 600,000 students each year through campus awareness programs. Her consistent message to students and to the world is that mental health needs to be talked about as easily as we speak about our physical health. Only then can we bring suicide and mental health into the open so that nobody has to struggle alone. So help me welcome Allison to the mic here.
Thank you so much, Mary Patrick. Sorry, I am short, so the microphone will come down for me. Thank you. I'm just truly honored to be here, to be with you, to have this really critical conversation, and want to thank Soka for having a conversation around mental health and suicide, because this can be scary. And sometimes when we're afraid of discussing things like mental health and suicide, we don't talk about it at all. And in fact, what we need to be doing is having these conversations, and we need to be kind of getting in the messy stuff, and we need to be having words and sidebar conversations and big open forums like this around mental health issues so that we can bring them into the light. And so it's truly an honor and a pleasure to be here, to be able to open up this session with you all. As you heard from Mary Patrick, my name is Allison Maehlman. I am the executive director and founder of Active Minds. Active Minds is a national organization that is headquartered in Washington, D.C., focused on changing the conversation about mental health. We are most well known for a network of chapters on college and high school campuses across the U.S. and all 50 states. More than 500 chapters of student-run groups at schools with students volunteering their extracurricular time to bring mental health education and programming to their peers and to their student body. We also have a number of programs, including a speakers bureau, a suicide prevention exhibit, stress relief activities, social media activities. I'll talk about them a little bit more as we go on, but our mission at Active Minds is to have conversations exactly like we're having right here, right now, to bring these conversations into the light, give everybody the opportunity to know that they're not alone, to know that mental health issues are real, they are ever present in our lives, and that there's hope, that there's so much reason to have hope. I'd like to, though, first start by telling you my story, partially because I would not be where I am right now if it weren't for my family history and my brother Brian, and also because it's through storytelling that we start recognizing that we're not alone in these struggles and in these experiences, and in fact, almost every one of us has a story and some sort of connection to mental health issues. But as you heard from Mary Patrick, my story revolves around my brother Brian. Brian and I grew up outside of Washington, D.C., Montgomery County, Maryland, if anybody's familiar with the D.C. area. Brian's 4 years older than me, actually exactly 4 years and 4 days. And so as we were going through school, I was kind of following in his footsteps every step of the way. In high school, Brian was an AP student. 5 of his 6 classes were AP Euro, AP Calculus, AP History, you name it. He was the president of our school's debate team. He loved sports, but he was awful at them. And so he was the announcer for our school's football games. He covered our football and basketball games for our local community newspaper. He was smart, he was funny, he had friends, he was a little nerdy, but had a big group of friends and really made for a name for himself at our high school. Brian got into his top choice college, which was Columbia University in New York, and so as I was entering high school and having to live up to the high standards that he had set for the Maehlman name there, Brian went off to Columbia. When he got to Columbia, he did what we are all told we're supposed to do as young adults, to make college the best time of our lives. And I put that in quotes because it's actually one of my least favorite sayings out there, because ask any college student how they're feeling right now, and very, very few, if any of them, will tell you that they're having the time of their life. But the problem is we put that out there and we tell young adults that this is the time, this is the best time of your life. And so when students aren't feeling that way, they think there's something wrong with them, and they think they're the only one and think that everybody else is having that great, grand old time. And they need to change, when in fact it's hard. Young adulthood is hard, and the transition, high school is hard, college is hard, the transition is hard, and we look back and we remember only the great times, but it's not always the case when we're in it. But Brian did what we're told we're supposed to do to make college the time of our lives. He immediately immersed himself in activities and academics, making a name for himself once again. He was interested in poli-sci, was interested in journalism. He immediately joined an a cappella group at Columbia. In addition to the school newspaper, he started covering the Columbia sports for the daily newspaper. Fast forward to his senior year, Brian had a 3.8 GPA. He was president of the a cappella group. He was the sports editor of the newspaper in addition to being a columnist. He was a star of the school's varsity rock and roll show, and again was a star on campus. But in November of his senior year, he went to the school's counseling services. It happened to be a Friday that he got the appointment with the clinician, and when he showed up to the appointment, the clinician identified that Brian was struggling, and unclear in that 1-hour session exactly what he was struggling with, but he was showing signs of depression and anxiety. We come from a really supportive family, and I feel very lucky for that. My mom is a clinical social worker, and with Brian telling the therapist that he saw at the counseling center about his struggle, and the fact that it was a Friday, the therapist recommended that he come home for the weekend just to relax, to get out of the hubbub of New York. November was when he saw this counselor. It was the middle of midterms. To come home, spend some time at home. And so he did. He hopped on the train. He came back down to D.C. and came home. But instead of going back to Columbia that Monday, he ended up seeing a local clinician who's a friend of the family. My mom, being a clinical social worker, knew people in the field. And so she was able to get him in to see somebody early that week. And he actually ended up seeing that person Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Friday of that week. And for any of you who are familiar with the mental health system, you know it's pretty unusual to see someone 4 days in 1 week. Usually it's once a week, maybe once every 2 weeks. During a diagnosis period, it might be a little bit more, but seeing somebody 4 days in 1 week is pretty atypical. But he ended up seeing this clinician that frequently, because what we uncovered was that Brian was struggling with something that was far more severe than what one would call typical college depression. And again, that's in quotes, because young adults are all kind of conditioned to recognize and understand that they're supposed to be stressed out, or they're not supposed to be sleeping a lot, and they're just not supposed to be feeling great, but like that's not okay. It's not okay to have this idea being, when somebody asks you how you are, your answer has to be, oh, I'm tired, or I'm stressed, or else there's something wrong with you. And in fact, young adults are walking around really not knowing when is it normal, when is it too much, and I must not be going through as bad as other people are, and so I shouldn't talk about it. And that was really the case with Brian. What we uncovered after a handful of weeks, Brian ended up taking some extra time back in DC and back at home. He ended up taking a leave of absence from Columbia in his senior year. And what we ended up uncovering was that he was dealing with a mental health disorder called schizoaffective disorder. Schizoaffective disorder is a combination of depression and schizophrenia. He was experiencing both the depressive symptoms typical of depression, as well as hearing voices. He had had some auditory hallucinations throughout the course of his diagnosis, and it was actually only at this time that he came home that we uncovered that he was dealing with schizoaffective disorder, and he had been dealing with it since February of his freshman year in college. Meanwhile, remember, this is his senior year when he finally went and sought help and took his leave of absence. But he actually, we learned later on, remembered hearing his first voice in February of his freshman year. None of Brian's voices was dangerous, and it's really important to me that you know the vast majority of people with mental illness are not dangerous, and if they intersect with violence at all, people with mental illness are far more likely to be the victim of violence than they are the perpetrator. But Brian had really started struggling hard with a serious mental illness in February of his freshman year of college, and yet by his senior year had earned a 3.8 GPA, become president of an a cappella group and sports editor of the paper, while he was struggling for his entirety of college. So we ended up taking this leave of absence and staying at home. I, meanwhile, the following May, graduated from high school. His friends from Columbia graduated, and his high school friends who had gone to different schools also graduated, and that was a hard period for him. because as a young adult, you're never really taught anything other than the fact that you go to high school for 4 years, and you go straight to college, and then you go straight to graduate school or kind of find your dream job. When in fact, a lot of people take a year off between high school and college, or take 5 or 6 or 7 years to get through school, or maybe when they graduate from college don't really know what they're going to do next. And it's a path that many of us will take, and yet that's never really communicated. So again, young adults are really struggling with this idea of, oh my goodness, I'm not on this path, and that was a really, really hard struggle for Brian, watching all of us move forward in this 4-year chunk, and he was still at home. He was talking about going back to school. My parents really wanted him to go to a local DC school. Brian really wanted to go back to Columbia and graduate from where he started. I went off to college, the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, and Brian was still at home, but in these conversations about going back to school. In March of my freshman year, I came back for a few days for spring break. Brian took me back to the metro so that I could get back up to Philadelphia to start my semester up again. And 3 days after my spring break ended, I got a call from my mom that Brian had taken his own life. He was 22 when he died. I was 18. This was a year and a half after Brian had taken that leave of absence, but it was a full 4 years after he had started struggling with his mental health issue. And there were a number of things that happened leading up to his death, but nothing that was the singular cause of his suicide. And it's something that I've had to come to learn over many, many years, is that there is no singular cause of a suicide, and there's not one thing I did or didn't say or couldn't have said, not one thing that my family could or couldn't have said that would have saved him, when in fact this was accumulation of many, many, many years of struggle for Brian and desolation and isolation that he felt, and he told us as much. And so, as a freshman in college, when I got that call from my mom, as you can imagine, I lost myself. It was always me, Allison and Brian. I was always the Allison of Allison and Brian. Our parents were divorced. They had been divorced before Brian died, and so the two of us would travel back and forth between our parents' homes, and we had just gotten to the point in our lives when we became friends and not just siblings. And here I was, an only child, having to balance what it would mean to be the daughter of divorced parents who needed to grieve in their own way. And as I threw myself into all the emotions around this grief, the one that was the most salient for me became fear, which is odd. I experienced the anger and the sadness and just the complete lack of control of my own emotions, but it was fear that became the most salient, because I realized that, Brian and I were really similar people. And the fact that he started struggling with his mental health in his freshman year, but he didn't tell anybody until his senior year, not even our really supportive social worker mom, not even me, his kid sister, I would have done the same thing. Nobody was talking about mental health issues. So there was no reason that Brian would have or should have come forward saying, hey, I'm struggling right now, or something doesn't feel right. Or we find out after the fact that his friends had noticed some changes in him at school, but he wasn't saying anything. They didn't want to say anything. They didn't really know what it meant, and so they kept it quiet. They're awesome people, but nobody had taught them what it was about or what these issues were, or that actually being a friend could mean going up to somebody and saying, hey, I'm worried about you. Are you okay? Can I walk you over to the counseling center? Can I call a crisis hotline number for you or with you? Can I sit in the room with you as you just want to cry? But nobody had taught his friends those messages, and nobody had taught that to me, his kid sister, either. And so after taking a little bit of time off myself to deal with Brian's death and come back, I started what became Active Minds, which was a student group on my campus organizing students to talk openly about mental health issues, because one of the things I realized was that nobody was talking about these issues, and if they were, the messaging wasn't coming across to students. And so then I dove into research, and what I found out was that actually Brian's story was pretty typical, that the age of onset of almost every mental health issue is the high school and college age. So the fact that Brian started experiencing his depression, her schizophrenia, when he was 18 is actually pretty typical. And yet, as an 18-year-old, nobody had ever taught me that. And so I knew right away that what we needed was a group of students who were talking to each other around mental health issues, getting simple signs and symptoms of mental health issues out there, messages around prevalence, but also messages about how to seek help and how to connect with people who might need help and connect them over to the counseling center. And so Active Minds was formed as a student group mobilizing young adults to change the conversation about mental health, to get a conversation going in their schools and in their communities, recognizing that these messages that never reached Brian's ears needed to have come from his friends and his peers, needed to have come from another freshman who was also struggling with his mental health when Brian started struggling, or needed to have come from a sophomore to show this freshman who was struggling, hey, I've been through this too, but I'm doing okay, or this is what my journey is like. Or a senior to say, yeah, I've been struggling with it, but I'm gonna graduate. And mental health issues are not a life sentence, and I'm still gonna be able to thrive. All sorts of messages that Brian hadn't heard. And so Active Minds was formed as a student group in my undergrad at University of Pennsylvania. And then when I graduated, I started the nonprofit in order to develop and support other chapters of that student group on college and high school campuses across the country, and more importantly, to mobilize a new generation who I saw very early on was treating mental health in a different way than our parents' and grandparents' generation did. I had friends, and Brian had friends, who had desperately wanting to know how to help more and how to do more. And so they sat with me in silence and said, Allison, how do we help? What do we do? How can we be there for you, even though we haven't been through this? And at the same time, my mom, she lost her friends. And it wasn't vindictive, but in the months after Brian's death, they didn't know what to say, and so they didn't say anything. This was many, many years ago. And so I will say times have changed a little bit, but what I saw very, very early on was there was a generation that was desperately wanting to know more, to do more, to treat mental health as their social justice issue, and just needed to be organized and needed to be given a tool and a platform to do so. Active Minds was formed as a nonprofit organization in 2003. We are now in our 16th anniversary year. We have grown from that one chapter at Penn to now more than 500, all run by student volunteers bringing this conversation to their school, with a number of programs that are bringing broader prominence to mental health and suicide prevention messaging. Our mission at Active Minds is to change the conversation about mental health. And what that means is first is to have a conversation about mental health. It was only after my brother died that I heard story after story after story from people in my life who also had a story, who also had a connection to suicide or depression or anxiety or schizoaffective disorder that I literally didn't know at all had any connection to mental health issues until my brother died and until I started becoming public with his story because I didn't know what else to do. And yet I learned that 1 in 4 Americans has a diagnosable mental health disorder, which means that every family is touched by this one way or another. And yet we're so quiet about these issues that we all think we're the only one. But we have an opportunity to step in to help each other, to help the young people in our lives, to help our communities, to help our workplaces, our campuses, create an environment where we are more mentally healthy and we're more well-connected. We were really proud this past summer to release a study done by the RAND Corporation of Active Minds. RAND studied Active Minds over a long period of time, and what RAND found was that the sheer presence of Active Minds at a school decreases stigma, improves attitudes, and actually changes behaviors. For students who aren't even part of Active Minds, who aren't even part of the group that are planning events for campus, but can say, oh yeah, that group exists on my campus, that's right. I've seen them chalk on a quad, or I've seen them flyer about a speaker. I knew that they hosted a speaker. Even people who didn't attend any of the events felt that their community, their campus, was supportive of mental health enough that they had improved attitudes and decreased stigma around mental health. And then for those students who were involved in Active Minds, they were the ones planning the events for their school, they actually showed behavior change and that they were reaching out for help more for themselves and their friends than they had in the past. This is simple culture change. This is simple climate change that we can all take and we can all make. And so I urge all of you tonight, you're here for a reason. Maybe you have a personal story. Maybe you know somebody that is struggling in your life. Maybe you're just interested in learning more. And what I would encourage you to do is talk. We need to create a community and a society where we talk as openly about mental health issues as we talk about all other health issues. So we create a space where people are reaching out for their mental health needs just as regularly as they are their physical health needs, so that the topic of suicide becomes way, way far down. But when we're only talking suicide, we're missing such a big part of people's lives where we can help them thrive. I believe so strongly that Brian's life would be different had he reached out for help earlier than he did, had he felt comfortable reaching out for help earlier, had he known where there were resources available, had his friends reached out to him when they noticed changes in him. We have that opportunity for so many Brians in our lives, though. The statistics are real. It's scary and it's intimidating to address these issues, but at the same time, help is out there. There are so many people living successfully with mental health diagnoses, and there is indeed so much reason to have hope. So I want to thank you all again so much for allowing me to be here with you tonight, and I have the distinct honor and pleasure of introducing Dr. Kay Redfield Jamison to the stage. Dr. Jamison is not only a professor of psychiatry at Johns Hopkins University and author of an extraordinary number of books that have walked all of us, many of us, I should say, through the path of understanding more about mental health and mental illness. But Dr. Jamison was also one of the first people of any notoriety who showed me support when I launched Active Minds as a 21-year-old wanting to figure out what to do in this world and how to make this world a better place, and to gain the support of somebody who is a hero to so many people, to say, yes, young people need to be in this, and yes, there's opportunity for hope and for change, was an extraordinary change and opportunity for me in my life. So Dr. Jamison, it is my pleasure to introduce you to the stage.
Thank you. What a delight to be here at a wonderful university. And I'm particularly honored to be speaking with Allison, who's done, I am taller? Yes. Who's done just remarkable things to make a difference. And I think the whole emphasis upon talking about these things, and not just talking about mental illness, mental health issues, and suicide, but also talking about them in an informed way. And one of the things I've been to quite a few of the support groups and the teaching groups of Active Minds on different college campuses, is that they bring in people who know what they're talking about. It's very easy to just babble on about mental health issues and not know what you're doing, and that doesn't do anybody any good. So anyway, thank you, Allison, and thank you for inviting me this evening. I teach at a medical school, and one of the things that's very clear is that if you want to make a difference in suicide, and if you want to make a difference in attitudes about mental illness, you really have to get through to doctors, because there's a huge, I wouldn't even say it's so much stigma, though it may be to an extent stigma, but until very recently in medicine, there's been a tendency to be somewhat dismissive of psychiatry as a field. That has changed remarkably as a result of the treatments, the new treatments, not so new, but treatments being newly recognized. And one of the things we've tried to do at Hopkins is to make it very clear to the medical students every year that we want to make it clear they need to talk about it and they need to learn about it. So we say to them, look, a lot of you are going to get depressed. Depression is really common. You're at the age of risk for depression. And we will do everything to get you good care here. There's no reason to think you won't get better. Very treatable illness. But if it doesn't get treated, it can be really bad and it can be lethal. And what we can't do is tolerate impaired doctors. Doctors have to be well in order to treat patients. But what we want you to do is be aware of what depression is all about, what the symptoms are. And so if you have depression, or one of your colleagues here has depression, or you think they do, to reach out and talk about it. That's easier said than done, but I think there's been a change in attitudes and talking about these things. Not as much as one would like, but some. So what I want to do this evening, first from a personal point of view, and then second from a more medical and clinical point of view, is to talk about how enormously complicated suicide is. And it really is complicated. If it weren't so complicated, we would have had better solutions, easier solutions to date, and we don't. What we do know, and it's what I'm going to be focusing on, I'm going to be focusing on some of the medical and clinical sides because, first of all, we have a lot of data and information about what works and what doesn't work, but also to try and convince you all that there is a real science to suicide. We know a lot, and it's still very complicated. So there are people in everything from epidemiologists to public health people to teachers to doctors, psychiatrists, internists, trying to grapple with this and make sense of it. As I said, it's very hard to do. It's been discouraging the last few years to see the upward rise in suicide, although always by historical circumstances, there's always been a great variation in the rates. So I'm going to talk a little bit later on about what we know about the rates of suicide and what we know about a few specific treatments that make a difference. But again, always to come back to the point, it's very complicated, but what's quite wonderful in this day and age is that the illnesses, the 4 or 5 major psychiatric illnesses that probably are involved in 90 to 95% of suicides are treatable. It's just a question of getting diagnosed properly and treated correctly. Let me just start with a personal story. Like Allison said, we are storytellers as a species, anciently and always probably. And one of the things that I did several years ago now was to come out about my own bipolar illness, from a history of quite severe manias and quite severe suicidal depressions, and ultimately a nearly lethal suicide attempt. And I got treated, and I've responded very well to treatment, as most people do with my illness. And I decided at some point that I would write publicly about it as part of a general effort by a lot of people to bring these illnesses out in the open. So let me just, after I wrote the book, I wrote a memoir called An Unquiet Mind, which is about my illness and background. I come from a, how should we say, not a politically conservative family, but a very socially conservative family. Not only a military officer's daughter, but more horrifyingly from a privacy point of view, an Episcopalian. And so these things do not gather together to make one very eager to talk about personal matters, and I didn't until nearly too late. Then when I was on this kind of book tour from hell, which seemed to go on forever, one of the things that struck me, I had no intention of writing about suicide. It certainly was a professional interest of mine. You can't really specialize in mood disorders without being very interested in suicide and very concerned about suicide. But I had no intention of writing a book. I didn't want to wake up in the morning and think for the next 2 or 3 years I'm going to be doing nothing but saturating myself in the subject of suicide. But what happened night after night was somebody would come up to me with a picture of a 15-year-old, 14-year-old, 20-year-old, a parent who had killed themselves. And it was so heartbreaking. And it was so deeply impressive what people had done, perhaps not to the extent that Allison has done in terms of this huge influence that she's had, but to reach back out into the community and give. I mean, people took from tragedy and gave back. So this is what I wrote at the beginning of my book about suicide. Summer evenings at the Bistro Gardens in Beverly Hills tended toward the long and languorous. My friend Jack Ryan and I went there often when I lived in Los Angeles, and I invariably ordered the Dungeness crab and a scotch on the rocks. Not invariably, but from time to time, Jack would use the occasion to suggest we get married. It was an idea with such potential for catastrophe that neither of us had much of an inclination to take the recurring proposal with too much gravity. But our friendship we took seriously. This particular evening, I found myself knocking the ice cubes around in my whiskey glass. The conversation was making me uneasy. We were talking about suicide and making a blood oath. If either of us again became deeply suicidal, we agreed we would meet at Jack's home on Cape Cod. Once there, the non-suicidal one of us would have a week to persuade the other not to commit suicide. A week to give all of the reasons we could come up with for why the other should go back on lithium, assuming that having stopped it was the most likely reason for the danger of suicide. We both had bipolar illness, and despite the better and often expressed judgment of others, had a tendency to stop taking our medication. A week to cajole the other into a hospital, to invoke conscience, to impress upon the other the pain and damage to our families that suicide would inevitably bring. We would, we said, during this hostage week, walk along the beach and remind the other of all the times we had felt at the end of hope and somehow had come back. Who, if not someone who had actually been there, could better bring the other back from the edge? We both, in our own ways and in our own intimate dealings with it, knew suicide well. We thought we knew how we could keep it from being the cause of death on our death certificates. We decided that a week was long enough to argue for life. If it didn't work, then at least we had tried. And because we had years of cumulative experience with lifestyles of snap impetuousness, and we knew how quick and final a suicidal impulse could be, we further agreed that neither of us would ever buy a gun. Nor, we swore, would we, under any circumstances, allow anyone else to keep a gun in any house in which we lived. We sealed our foray into the planned and rational world. Still, I had my doubts. I listened to the details, helped clarify a few, drank the rest of my scotch, and stared at the tiny white lights in the gardens around us. Who are we kidding? Never once during any of my sustained bouts of suicidal depression had I been inclined or able to pick up a telephone and ask a friend for help. Not once. It wasn't in me. How could I seriously imagine that I would call Jack, make an airline reservation, get to an airport, rent a car, and find my way out to his house on the Cape? It seemed only slightly less absurd that Jack would go along with the plan, although he at least was extremely rich and could get others to handle the practicalities. The more I thought about the whole arrangement, the more skeptical I became. It is a tribute to the persuasiveness, reverberating energies and enthusiasms, and infinite capacity for self-deception of two manic temperaments that by the time our dessert soufflés arrived, we were utterly convinced that our pact would hold. He would call me, I would call him. We would outmaneuver the Black Knight and force him from the board. If it's ever been taken up as an option, however, the Black Knight has a tendency to remain in play. And so it did. Many years later, Jack had long since married and I had moved to Washington. I received a telephone call from California. Jack had put a gun to his head, said a member of his family, and put a bullet through his brain. No week in Cape Cod, no chance to dissuade. A man who had been inventive enough to earn 1,000 patents for such wildly diverse creations as the Hawk and Sparrow missile systems used by the United States Department of Defense, toys played with by millions of children around the world, and devices used in virtually every household in America. A Yale graduate and a great lover of life, a hugely successful businessman. This remarkably imaginative man had not been inventive enough to find an alternative solution to a violent, self-inflicted death. Although shaken by Jack's suicide, I was not surprised by it, nor was I surprised that he had not called me. I, after all, had been dangerously suicidal myself on several occasions since our compact, and certainly not called him. Nor had I even thought of calling him. Suicide is not beholden to an evening's promises, nor does it always hearken to plans drawn up in lucid moments and banked in good intentions. I know this for an unfortunate fact. Suicide has been a professional interest of mine for many years, and a personal one for considerably longer. I have a hard-earned respect for suicide's ability to undermine, overwhelm, outwit, devastate, and destroy. As a clinician, researcher, and teacher, I have known or consulted on patients who hanged, shot, or asphyxiated themselves, jumped to their deaths from stairwells, buildings, or overpasses, died from poisons, fumes, prescription drugs, slashed their wrists, cut their throats. Close friends, fellow students from graduate school, colleagues, and children of colleagues have done similar or the same. Most were young, and all suffered from mental illness. Each left behind a wake of unimaginable pain and unresolvable guilt. Like many who have bipolar illness, I have also known suicide in a more private, awful way. And I traced the loss of a fundamental innocence to the day that I first considered suicide as the only solution possible to an unendurable level of mental pain. Until that time, I had taken for granted and loved more than I knew a temperamental lightness of mood and a fabulous expectation of life. I knew death only in the most abstract of senses. I never imagined it would be something to arrange or seek. I was 17 when, in the midst of my first depression, I became knowledgeable about suicide in something other than an existential adolescent way. For much of each day during several months of my senior year in high school, I thought about when, whether, where, and how to kill myself. I learned to present to others a face at variance with my mind, ferreted out the location of 2 or 3 nearby tall buildings with unprotected stairwells, discovered the fastest flows of morning traffic. I learned how to load my father's gun. The rest of my life at the time, sports, classes, writing, friends, planning for college, fell fast into a black night. Everything seemed a ridiculous charade to endure, a hollow existence to fake one's way through as best one could. But gradually, layer by layer, the depression lifted, and by the time my senior prom and graduation came around, I had been well for months. Suicide had withdrawn to the back squares of the board and become once again simply unthinkable. Chillingly, no one close to me had any idea of the psychological company I had been keeping. The gap between private experience and its public expression was absolute. My persuasiveness to others that I was fine was unimaginably frightening. Over the years, my manic depressive illness became much, much worse. And the reality of dying young from suicide became a dangerous undertow in my dealings with life. Then, when I was 28 years old, after a damaging and psychotic mania, followed in turn by a particularly prolonged and violent siege of depression, I took a massive overdose of lithium. I was a lithium researcher by that time, and I knew the lethal dose of lithium. I took much more. I unambivalently wanted to die and nearly did. Death from suicide had become a possibility, if not probability, in my life. Under the circumstances, I was during this time a young faculty member in a Department of Academic Psychiatry, UCLA. It was not a very long walk from personal experience to clinical and scientific investigation. I studied everything I could about my disease and read all I could find about the psychological and biological determinants of suicide. As a tiger tamer learns about the minds and moves of his cats, and a pilot the dynamics of the wind and air, I learned about the illness I had and its possible endpoint. I learned as best I could and as much as I could about the moods of death. As I mentioned, I had been, when I was first actually seen by a psychiatrist, I was very quickly and accurately diagnosed, put on lithium, responded very well. But then I went, like many people, went on and off my medication, which each time was disastrous. As my psychiatrist said once, don't you think you've run this particular experiment often enough to know the outcome? But being a slow and stubborn learner, it took a while. My suicide attempt changed my attitude about everything. It was very clear to me I was either going to have to stay in treatment or die. There was just nothing in between. It was completely clear, and I have stayed on lithium since, and I've been fine. But it's a hard lesson, series of lessons that people learn. I got very interested after my first manic break in mood disorders, and I've been studying them since. They're very interesting illnesses. They're very common illnesses, depression and bipolar illness. But they are also potentially quite lethal. And in fact, the mood disorders are more associated with suicide than anything else. So as I said, I wanted to talk maybe show about 10 slides. They're sort of clinically based, so I hope your eyes won't glaze over too much. But what I do want to indicate is I'm going to focus on my own field, which is more the kind of medical side of an approach to suicide, and that's not to minimize other approaches, social approaches, public health approaches. They're all important and they all need to be done. But what I want to do is focus on, there's one particular drug that it turns out has been shown in 150, 200 studies now to very much decrease the rate of suicide. And so I just want to show you a few slides along those lines, because I think these things don't get discussed enough. In terms of not talking about the illnesses, we also don't talk about what works often enough. And one of my colleagues once said that if you had a drug that cut the death rate in breast cancer as much as the lithium does with suicide, it would be over the top fold of the New York Times. But we just don't look at suicide as quite the same kind of death as we do other illnesses. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the numbers, a little bit about one of the major clinical problems is that not only are the major psychiatric illnesses associated with early onset, which say, as Allison did, high school, college years, but the suicide rate is staggeringly high in the illnesses under the age of 30, in the illnesses most likely to result in suicide. So it creates an incredibly, intensely difficult clinical situation of trying to get people in to treatment, to diagnose them properly, to get them to take treatment as they will, as they need to. So, can you see that, the slide? Should the lights be down a little bit, maybe? What? It looks like a Band-Aid. Oh, it's a Rothko. Sorry. It's the painter Rothko who died by suicide, sorry. Is it possible to turn the lights down a wee bit? Somewhere. Guess not. Okay, so I just want to give you a sense of the magnitude of the problem of suicide. Occasionally, my colleagues will say things like suicide is a rare event. And it's very, very hard to understand where that statement comes from. It's a very common saying in the public, is that suicide's a rare event. It's not a rare event. It's the 10th leading cause of death in the United States. There are 1 million deaths by suicide at least every year, probably underreported. And there's every 40 seconds, somebody dies by suicide. In the United States, it's the second leading cause of death among 10 to 34-year-olds. Second cause of death in college students. It's the first cause of death amongst medical students, and it's a very real issue for those of us who teach in medical schools. Women physicians have 5 times the general population rate of suicide. Male physicians about twice the population rate. And this somewhat incoherent slide, I just want to point out that as people get older, the death rate by suicide goes up as the cause of death. And young people, obviously, things like accidents are more commonly the cause of death. As people reach adolescence and college, suicide in green is much more commonly the cause of death. What I'd like to do is point out a couple things on this slide. One is that the single greatest predictor of completed suicide is a previous attempt, a serious attempt at suicide. It's about 40 times the risk of dying by suicide if you've attempted it. But mood disorders, as you can see, depression and bipolar illness, and actually bipolar disorder or manic depression is actually probably more associated with suicide than depression is, depending on how you diagnose it. What we know is particularly puts people at risk for suicide is the combination of mood disorder, whether it's bipolar illness or depression, along with alcohol and or drug use. But most of the psychiatric illnesses have an elevated rate of suicide, but what's interesting, if you look at illnesses, medical illnesses, where you think there might be an elevated rate of suicide because of, terminal aspects, people are near death or great incapacity. In fact, the rates of suicide in those groups are very, 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 very much lower than they are for the psychiatric illnesses. And this, without going into great detail here, I want to make a point that isn't clinically made often enough, and it's particularly a problem in young people, is the fact that suicide risk is highest early on in the disease. So if you get bipolar illness at 20, your risk of committing suicide is much higher, partly because you haven't been diagnosed, partly because suicide is often a result of an interaction of the underlying psychiatric disorder with impulsiveness, agitation, and so forth. And that people sometimes get slightly less inclined in that direction as they get older. And this is just a slide to show what Allison was pointing out and what's very clear in the literature is, again, this is not cardiac disease. This is not cancer. These are illnesses that hit young. And that's a very, very important point because it's at a time when people are most vulnerable, when they're most able to talk about turmoil in their lives and not be able to distinguish normal turmoil from mental turmoil. So it's just important to keep that in mind, that this is a very high risk age. And I frequently say when I go out to talk to college students, bipolar illness having a particularly young age of onset is that, this is a really bad illness to get, but it's a great time to get it. I mean, we know a lot about these illnesses, and I think that's really important. We know a lot how to treat them. We know a lot about the underlying science and the neuroscience, and the research is going very, very quickly. So even though it seems sometimes hopeless and a bit messy, in fact, the science is, and the medicine is actually really quite good. And here I just want to address the point that I mentioned briefly before of the interaction of age and illness. So this is a study that looked at all the patients who'd been diagnosed in Sweden with bipolar disorder, and then following up those people to see death rates by suicide. And what you can see is there's just staggeringly high suicide rates in bipolar illness across all ages. So women, just if you look at all ages of people who are bipolar, women had 20 times the rate of the general population, and men 15. But if you take those people who have bipolar disorder who are under the age of 30, they have 70 to 80 times the rate of suicide. This is really an important clinical point. So, I mean, it just says you've got to really concentrate your clinical time, psychotherapeutic time, medication time to understanding this group of people and really being quite intensive about it. So, even though suicide is a grim topic by definition, again, I can do nothing but extend hope in terms of people being able to intervene with it and prevent it. Not always, but it's something that we have a lot of treatments for and treatments that work. So we have a lot of treatments for depression, and most of you will know many of these medications, the antidepressant medications, new experimental drugs like ketamine, which work very quickly, particularly in suicidal depression, psychotherapy, and what we know is that the combination of psychotherapy and medication is generally more effective than either one alone in people who have moderate to severe depression. And electroconvulsive therapy, ECT, shock therapy. In terms of bipolar illness, lithium remains very much the gold standard, but very much underutilized. There are other drugs that have taken over the market. Lithium is not patentable because it's an element, which makes it very unattractive to drug companies because there's zero profit motivation. But it's a very interesting drug, a very old drug, and it's one we know a lot about clinically because it's been used for 60 years. But we also know not only its anti-suicide effect, but its neuroprotective effect. So one of the things that we know is that if you have recurrent manias, for example, that is really not good for your brain. So if you take scans of people, brain scans of people who've had one manic episode versus 7 manic episodes, you really want the brain of somebody who's had one episode. And one of the things that we know about lithium is it's neuroprotective, and it tends to repair some of that change. It's a quite extraordinary drug. ECT, again, very effective in treating suicidal depression, and psychotherapy and various other treatments. I just wanted to talk a couple of slides here and then end about lithium's efficacy in preventing suicide. And this is an example of a public health problem because of the underutilization of lithium. There are pockets in America where people use lithium a lot. I mean, Johns Hopkins is one of them, the Harvard teaching hospitals are another. There's certain groups of hospitals that use lithium as the first choice. But there are a lot of places that don't, and it's a problem. So here's just one slide to give you an idea. If you look at on the left, you see the rates of suicide in people not on lithium and on lithium, and you can see very much fewer, and likewise attempts. This is, as I say, there have been an incredible number of studies, all in the same direction. There's recently a meta-analysis, a review of many studies of this. And the conclusions of that, of looking at does suicide bring down does lithium bring down the suicide rate in people with mood disorders? And this is a large study that came out a couple of years ago from Oxford. And there's overwhelming evidence, their conclusions were the overwhelming evidence to support the anti-suicidal effects of lithium, that lithium should be the treatment of choice, that it reduces mortality from other causes, not just suicide. And I say this not because I'm actually pushing lithium, though I probably am, but it's because it's an interesting example of where the public generally has no idea there's actually a medication out there that helps to prevent suicide. And that's an astonishing thing. And all of the public discussion that you will read, you'll pick up the newspaper, pick up a magazine, turn on the news, and you'll hear a lot about suicide. But not much about what we know about the illnesses underlying suicide, well, a lot of suicide, most suicides, and treatments that work. And there are a lot of hypotheses, which I won't go into, but I mean, one of them is obviously it treats the underlying illness. But it also, we know about lithium that even if you don't have a mental illness and you have aggression and impulsivity, which are in their own right associated with suicide, that it reduces that, and that's true whether you're a rat or a human, or both. Sorry. I'm from Washington. Okay, so let me just end with this and this is somewhat a discouraging slide, but I guess, I just work around so many incredibly good doctors and scientists who are doing such great stuff about the illnesses associated with suicide and the treatments for depression and bipolar illness and schizophrenia, that I think it's heartening. I think it is, as I say, a complicated situation. So this is a slide that the former director of the National Institute of Mental Health used to use about where scientific research has been and that it has perhaps lagged a bit on such a complicated problem. So if you look at the change in mortality and death rates over time, from 65 to 2000, say, you can see the death rate from leukemia has gone way down in that period of time. If you look at heart disease, likewise, really gone down for a lot of medical reasons and weight control reasons, exercise, statins, whatever. AIDS, way down. Stroke, again, way down, not as much as one would like, but way down. And then you have suicide. And that is both discouraging, majorly discouraging, but it's been complicated over the years, of course, by opioid crisis, by many things, I think, not by disproportionate lack of access to mental health services on the part of patients, and so forth. So I'll leave that somewhat discouraging slide with you, but also to say, again, that it has been my great privilege to work in a medical school that, along with so many other medical schools and hospitals across the world, are working on this very actively. The military, the United States military, working on it unbelievably aggressively and well, and devoting a lot of resources, and public health service. But it's going to obviously take more time. Thanks very much. And now I think that Alice and I were going to just answer some questions, or Allison is.
Okay, let's give both our speakers another round of applause. All right, this is the Q&A section of our critical conversation, and I want to invite people to come to the mics. We have them located in the front. There's a mic 1, 2, 3, and 4. Could we drop some of those house lights because I cannot see into the house? Is there anyone at a mic up there? I see there is someone up there now. Thank you. Okay, I want to also point out that in the program it says we're going to take a break and then come back to Q&A. We're not going to do that because I spoke to Kay and Allison earlier, and they are going to just continue on with the Q&A until we have to end a little bit before 9 o'clock. We understand that not everyone has the stamina to continue on, and as Kay pointed out, she's used to working with doctors and medical students who get up and down in her classes all the time, so it won't be a problem. But we do want to get as many people and questions answered as possible. So I'll start back there on mic number 3 if you want to ask your question. Yes.
Actually, it's more of a comment. I just wanted to thank Dr. Jamison for the profound effect that her book, The Unquiet Mind, had on me back in 1995. I was diagnosed at 36 with bipolar. As a result of, I feel like I've had a very successful life, but a very harrowing life. And I feel that it's only because of work that you've done and others like you who have given those of us who felt like we were on our own, so to speak, an avenue for hope. So I just want you to know that. And also, Ms. Maehlman, I was in education as a teacher and administrator for 44 years. And so when you talked about the work that you've been doing, I just got so excited because I thought there's someone out there that's making a profound difference in that age group, and it just gives me a lot of hope as well. So I thank you both. Thank you.
Thank you.
Diego.
One moment,
Can you hear
please.
me?
Is mic number 4 on? Try again.
Now it is, I think. Can you
Okay,
hear me?
we're going to go
Okay.
down to mic number 2 while they correct that, or you can step across the aisle. Go ahead.
Hi. This question is for Ms. Maehlman. I was watching a video today of you as a guest speaker last year on a program from Al Jazeera, and in that segment you were shown a tweet from somebody who had, like you, recently lost a family member to suicide. And one of the things they said was that if you ask someone if they're okay and they say yes, that's not always true. And I have seen that in a lot of people around me as well. So my question is, what can we as individuals and advocates do to make sure that people are getting the right kind of treatment even when they resist it from others, or even when they say they're okay when they're not?
Thank you for the, can you hear me? Okay. Thank you for the question, and it's such an important one because everything that we're talking about comes down to person-to-person interaction, right? This is all about what we can do in our own lives, the lives of our family members, our friends, and yes, we'll talk often. People will often ask me, okay, I asked a friend, like, I'm worried about them, and I said, are you okay? And they said, yeah, I'm fine. What do I do? So my answer is keep letting them know that you're there for them. One of the most simple things that we can do for the people in our life is to say, I'm here for you. And for those of us who struggle, it can be hard, A, to recognize that we're struggling, or B, be in a place to say, yes, I'm struggling. And as Kay said, in reading her book, the last thing that you do is, hold up your hand and say, there's something wrong with me, I need to make a phone call to do it, whatever it may be. And so I'll call it a caregiver, the best thing that you can do is to continue to let that person know, I'm here for you, I'm gonna keep checking in on you, not well, let me know if you need anything, because that's not what people are going to be able to do, but as a caregiver, to keep checking in and to say, I'm not going to judge you. I care about you for who you are. I love you for who you are. Whatever the language is that makes sense, you are great the way you are, and I want to help you become the best version of you, and I'm here for you always. And then as a caregiver, whether you are giving care for somebody who has a serious mental illness and you're in it daily, or somebody who is really worried about somebody who may or may not be getting help, you also deserve support. We have this common misnomer, misperception in our society that you have to have a clinical mental illness to go to therapy and to get diagnosed, and that's not the case. Like, the moment that something is interfering with your ability to live the life that you want to live, you should talk to somebody about it. So as the sister of somebody who was struggling, I deserved counseling just as much as Brian did, and no matter the clinical diagnosis or not, it's hard to be a caregiver, as it is hard to be somebody who is struggling with a health issue or a mental health issue. And so I would also encourage you to talk to somebody, whether it be a therapist or a parent or another friend, somebody, so that you're not bottling up inside, because it's a lot of weight on somebody's shoulders to have to be going through this and to feel the onus of responsibility on yourself.
We're into our third generation of severe schizoaffective disorder, and we're into our third generation of severe schizoaffective disorder in a family that's pretty small. I'm a physician, and I'm kind of confused about where we're at currently with the genetics. I had one son with cystic fibrosis, and even though that's an easier tracking because of the gene was finally identified, it seems like I don't see much on comparing family members genetically, and what's the status of what's going on behind the scenes?
I didn't actually, somehow it's diffusing, or can you hear that very well? It was a question about schizoaffective disorder, and
if I'm paraphrasing correctly, you're in your third generation of it in your family, and you're wondering what clinically there is that may...
It was... Right. Right.
We're pretty good at comparing family
right.
members before we even have the gene.
Right.
So in my family, where everybody has it, nobody is even curious about that.
Let me go back in general to bipolar illness and what is schizoaffective disorder. And schizoaffective disorder generally refers to a clinical course. Generally, if you have mania and depression, you have normal periods of functioning between them. With schizoaffective disorders, a lot of exceptions, but with schizoaffective disorder, it's more likely to be more chronic and characterized by some psychotic symptoms. The more that it has manic features attached to it, genetically, it's far more related to bipolar illness. If it is more of a depressive, it's a component to it with psychotic features, you think of it as probably leaning more toward the schizophrenic side of things. We know a lot about the genetics of bipolar illness. There are, as we speak, hundreds of laboratories across the world looking at that, making a lot of progress on that. And one of the things that we know from the studies of, actually from Dr. Potash at Hopkins, is that there's one place where there's overlapping genetic material for schizophrenia and bipolar illness, and that's where the psychosis, where paranoid delusions. So we know that very specifically seems to cluster together. So, and that's something that you would think would be more associated with schizoaffective. Schizoaffective tends to be a very problematic diagnosis, and it tends to be something that a lot of people are wrongly diagnosed as when in fact they have bipolar illness. It's just sort of an atypical presentation. So it's not been studied genetically nearly as much.
Let's try mic 4 again and see if that's working.
Is it working?
We'll see.
Oh, good.
We're getting a little feedback back here. So.
Feedback. I mean, makes a noise or... Well, let me start talking. We'll see what happens. I saw the half-page ad about the program in the LA Times.
Are you hearing her?
No, I can't.
I'm sorry. I'm
Do you want to come down here?
Okay. Maybe we could get you down to one of the
Is
other
this
mics.
working? This isn't
Call-
working.
Yeah, you know, I don't think, Sam, that this is working well for us up here. I also want to make a comment. If there's people who don't want to come to the mic, all of our ushers have question cards and pens. If you would rather write down a question, they will bring them up to me, and we'll do our best to answer those that we can before the end of the evening. I'm going to go up to mic number 3. Would you like to ask your question? What? Oh, she came down.
I'm down here.
It's good. Everyone's on your team. Thank you.
I'll walk up now.
I walk around the room 3 times.
Come on up. Sit down.
Okay. I saw the half-page ad in the LA Times about this program, and I knew I had to come up. I'm from San Diego. I was so happy to see it with Insight, Hope, and Help. My background is, briefly, I didn't start antidepressants till I was 45, and 5 years ago I started on Depakote. But I had a huge crisis 6 months ago. I had to move here. I didn't want to move here. So I went to the hospital to get some help. So I discovered, this is what I discovered, there's every group under the sun: anxiety, depression, mindfulness, grief for people who have lost someone to suicide. There's nothing that will help someone who has suicidal ideation and wants to share that, because these people do not know what it's about. My counselor tried to tell me that, oh, suicide falls under depression. I'm like, no, they're 2 different things. I mean, so many people are depressed, but you don't say, oh, are you going to kill yourself? I mean, and so there is no group.
You probably should, actually.
What's that?
Well, I mean, you should, if somebody's depressed, you probably should be asking, you know, have you had any thoughts of hurting yourself, or, you know,
Oh,
I mean, this is...
I'm talking about the kind of depression that they say, oh, you go out to have coffee, someone says, oh, I'm so depressed, I flunked my final. I mean, how do, you know, it's kind of, I can't imagine asking someone who's depressed because of a situational thing. They're not, I mean, in fact, like you said, to me, people who are serious won't say anything. They'll put on a perfect front. Because I've gone out to coffee with my friends, I just talk normally, and I'm thinking, what if I told her that I was going to, you know, not be here tomorrow? Well, I tried it a little bit with some friends. I just said things like, oh, I know, maybe I just shouldn't be here. And they go like, oh, no, don't think like that. Don't, I mean, they just go nuts. So anyway, where did they put me? They put me in a senior support group. So I'm in there, I'm like, he said, oh, but we talk about death in there. And so I went to this group and I said, well, I'm just going to tell the truth. And of course, none of them can relate to what I was saying, and the group just went on. So I actually called the LA Times city desk, and I left a message and asked if they couldn't come down and cover this program and write some kind of three-page spread that talks about the people that are going to commit suicide that probably wouldn't if they could go to a group and talk to other people. And some kids started a suicide cafe just so people could go there. And so this nice guy at the city, LA city desk, he was so nice, he actually said he was just going to call me back because I left a message. And then he said, well, do you believe in God? Maybe you can go to church and talk to a pastor. I said, well, yes, but I really need to talk to someone who knows what I'm going through. So he says, oh, wait a minute, I'll Google and see what I can find for you. And he came back and he said, here's the mental health department of the county. He was being nicer to me than either my psychiatrist or my counselor. And so I called the mental health department.
Could I just interrupt you?
I'm almost
okay.
done.
I was
Just
just
like
going to say
one
that.
more thing.
Yeah, that would.
Yeah, just one more thing. That this is another example. She was really nice. She said, are you feeling suicidal? Do you have a plan? Has someone in your family done this? And I said, oh, I'm doing all that. Do you have a group I can go to? She says, oh, no, we don't have a group. But there's another group we have called Surviving the Death of a Person Who Committed Suicide. I'm serious. I'm like, what? So I said, I just feel totally isolated because I would like to talk to someone, and you really just can't talk to someone on the street that they don't understand it. So I would like to see somehow more, I would like to see these hospitals have to set up something for people because it's supposed to be very important. I think it would help if that, I feel like the medical community has just dropped the ball totally. So that's what I came here for.
Thank you. I have a few of the question cards, and what is the earliest age that bipolar could be diagnosed in children?
Okay, general comment about bipolar illness in children is that it's reasonably straightforward to diagnose bipolar disorder in adults and in adolescents. And in adolescents, the clinical presentation is pretty much similar to adults. Treatments are pretty much the same. The younger you get, the much more problematic it is in terms of accurate diagnosis. And some people, to some extent, it depends on your zip code, quite literally. That in some very wealthy communities, people get diagnosed probably much younger than in other communities. People have been diagnosed in literature as young as 2. The question is, before modern times, if you looked at the psychiatric literature from the 19th century, it's exceedingly unusual to have prior to puberty. One of the things that's happened is that the age of puberty has gone down, and therefore the age of onset of all the major psychiatric illnesses has gone down. There are a lot of things that can look like bipolar illness. Mania itself looks quite different in children usually. So depending on who's doing the diagnosis and how strict the diagnostic criteria are, it determines a lot.
Thank you. I'm going to go up to mic number 3 if you'd like to make a comment or ask a question.
Yeah, good evening. My name is Chris. I was diagnosed bipolar 1 at 19. I didn't accept it till I was 25. I've had like 7 or 8 manic episodes and some other ones too, but who's counting? But anyways, how much does environment play? Because all the episodes seem to fall in the same month and the same time of year, and I struggle like in March and May and stuff like that. That's my question. Thank you.
There's a very strong seasonal component to both depression and mania. The first manic episode can be more environmentally determined, and one of the things that happens, for example, if you've got the genetic predisposition for bipolar illness, if you go to college kids tend to do 2 things that are likely to precipitate the first manic episode. They would probably almost certainly get manic anyway, but determines the timing of it, which is sleep deprivation and alcohol use. So that first episode can look very much, quote, stress related, and then mania and depression take on lives of their own. March is not an unusual time for mania to occur, and if you look at the psychiatric literature, actually people are much more likely to get hospitalized at certain times of the year for mania and at other times of the year for depression. And in terms of suicide, much more likely to commit suicide in May and June and July than other times of the year. So they're very strong seasonal for a lot of reasons, a lot of evolutionary reasons.
Thank you. Kay, can you speak to your personal experience and general tolerance of the side effects of lithium, especially long-term?
Sure. I started taking lithium when lithium was only recently approved by the FDA for treatment. It had actually been used in Europe for quite some time before that, but not in this country. So at the time that I was put on lithium, I was put on very high doses of it because that's what the prescribing patterns were, and it actually was necessary for a while probably to keep my mania in check. The side effects at that time were almost intolerable. I had slurred speech on occasion, and I'd walk into, my coordination was completely whacked. I ended up in the emergency room, toxic, needing IV drips, and I couldn't think well and I couldn't see well, but other than that, it was fabulous. So, it's rather like, my husband's a cardiologist at Hopkins, and he's makes the point, is that people in psychiatry tend to go on about side effects. Try being a cardiologist, try being an oncologist with chemotherapy. I mean, to save people's lives, you very often have to do kind of radical things. I had a very tough time because I couldn't read, and I was a young assistant professor trying to compete. I'd have to underline everything. I couldn't read a book for 10 years. It was really not good. But science moves on and medicine moves on. And what my colleagues figured out all around the world was you could pull people down, way down on their lithium levels. And the lithium levels would work. The lithium would work as effectively. So I am still on lithium. I've remained on lithium for 1,000 years. And I have essentially no side effects now and no physical complications. It's actually, once you get into the right pattern of it, it's okay. To begin with, it was not good.
All right, mic number 1.
So thank you for the presentation. This is actually a question for Ms. Allison Maehlman, and thank you for everything. I actually really wonder, when we kind of learn about this mental health kind of awareness, education, we always kind of encourage, if any friend or family, approach you, they are struggling with depression, anxiety, whatever, we kind of told, really encourage that person to go to see the counselor or, the mental health profession. But I don't know, I just feel like if I were in the position, if I opened up and they asked for the help and then their response was go to see the counselor, I feel like it was kind of dropping the ball, So it's understand, it's kind of physical health, and if I broke my, bone or something like that, then go to the doctor, don't talk to me, that kind of stuff too. But I think the mental health is a little bit different from the physical health, and then I think the friends support, family support is really important. So, I totally see the importance of seeking out professional help too, but at the same time, I don't really want to sound like I'm kind of dropping a ball, don't talk to me, go to see the, professional. So how do you kind of approach that? Yeah.
It's a great question, and I think, at the end, you got to where, so the question is, in physical health, if somebody has a broken bone or whatnot, you tell them to go to the doctor and kind of put it on the doctor. But in mental health, if somebody opens up to you and says, I'm struggling, and you say, go talk to a therapist, it can feel like you're dropping the ball and you're kind of abandoning your friend. And I think the point that you made at the end is exactly where I would go, is it's not just about don't talk to me, go talk to somebody else. That sounds like it hurts, or that sounds really hard. I'd love to help you get to a therapist to talk to somebody about this. Because one of the things that we don't do enough is we don't treat mental health issues as real health issues in our society. Mental health issues are real health issues. Dr. Jamison talked all about the science, the epidemiology. There's so much that we know, and if we still consider mental health struggles as kind of soft issues, then we lose the fact that they are treatable, that there is help out there, and sometimes it's medication, and sometimes it's therapy, and sometimes it's both, and sometimes it's ECT, whatever it ends up being. But if we feel like we just need to take it on and it's like, oh, just talk about it, you'll be fine, then there's a whole aspect of this that we're not giving both the gravity and also the respect. So in mental health, it's about a relationship, it's about community, and it's about I'm really worried. I want to help you get the support that you deserve, and I want to be there for you, and I'm a friend, or I'm a sister, or I'm a daughter, and I can't make you better because I'm not a clinician, but I'm here for you, and I won't judge you for it. And I think that's the language that we need to be using. We need to continue to provide that kind of emotional support, but we also need to demonstrate that these are real issues that need and deserve real medical support. In the same way that if somebody had a broken bone, it wouldn't be, oh, just go walk it off, or you should be able to heal it. It's the same thing with a mental illness. You don't just heal yourself, and you don't just walk it off, and it's taking little language changes for us to get to a place where we can actually respect that, but we don't lose that sense of connection from person to person. Thank you.
Mic number 2.
Howdy. So my name is Mike. I'm an associate marriage and family therapist in Costa Mesa, actually at Living Success Center. I'm also a doctoral student at Aligned International University, PsyD, not PhD, and I cannot agree with what you just said more. So I have a comment for you, Allison. So my little sister Emma, when she was 6 years old, passed away. Not from suicide, from an accident. And I decided that I was going to make my life about helping people, and so that's why I became a therapist, and that's why I'm pursuing the doctorate and trying to get, into the field, into research to help as many people as I possibly can. So I think it's so important when we talk about our origin stories. When I teach at Align, I always have my students think about their origin story. What made you a therapist? And always hang on to that. And so thank you for always opening your presentations with talking about your brother, just like I always like to talk about my sister. So I really appreciate that. I think working in the field, having had 2 patients who have completed suicide and about 5 patients who have attempted, thankfully they didn't complete. I think one of the things that's very important in our community is knowing and having the awareness that, unfortunately, we are the professionals, we are the clinicians, and we need people to come to us. We can outreach and we can do events like this and speak and say how much we want to see people. And it's not a stigma, and I go see a therapist. I'm a therapist. I see a therapist sometimes twice a week. I love seeing my therapist. His name's John. I love him. I couldn't do my job without him, and so I wonder how people go on without seeing sometimes me. And sometimes what's the most important thing in a person's life is when they have someone tell them, hey, yeah, I know this guy. He likes the Ducks. He's kind of weird. He's kind of quirky, but he's kind of cool. You should go talk to him. And I think that conversation, what you're talking about, is what's missing. It's the person going to the other person saying, hey, I don't think anything's wrong with you. I just don't know how to help you. But he does, or they do, or that hospital or clinic or community counseling agency that's outside, like they know how to help you. I think that's the part that's missing from the discussion so many times. Dr. Jamison, if I may just ask, I have a lot of patients who are on lithium, and it's difficult. And I know med compliance is something that we're taught from day one in grad school. Med compliance, psychotherapy, psychomedication, bring it home. I have a hard time getting my patients to be med compliant with lithium. Can you help me and maybe coach me a little bit on that conversation and how I might become more effective with keeping them on the lithium? Thank you both for your time.
Sure. It's getting people into treatment for bipolar illness and getting them to stay on treatment are the 2 most difficult things by far. It's part of the age of onset, but it's also, we know that 50% of people with bipolar illness will stop taking their medication against medical advice. I think I teach, one of the sections that I teach at Hopkins is on medication adherence, and the residents, I have a discussion about it, which is that I think doctors, clinicians, therapists, whatever you want to call it, but in this case doctors, the doctors have an obligation to persuade. And that doesn't mean to twist arms, that doesn't mean to say this is a great drug and you should be taking it and don't be an ingrate, that kind of paternalistic, idiotic model. It means that you have to persuade on the basis of science, of what you know about this drug. And a lot of people don't know very much about the medications. They don't know the dangers of stopping the medications. They don't know the risks involved. They can't seriously address. We just had a meeting at Hopkins last week, and the task was we got probably 20 people, the major bipolar researchers and clinicians in the country, to come in and discuss how do you discuss positive aspects of this illness simultaneously with the dangerous aspects of the illness without romanticizing a lethal bad illness. Because there are positive aspects of this illness, and those are tied up to a lot of the reasons why some people stop taking medications, particularly people who get euphoric manias, which is about 50% of people who get manic. So we literally are writing up a paper for the American Journal of Psychiatry that's simple-minded, but it's like saying, these are some of the phrases you can use to elicit what is it that you would miss, and how is it that we can have serious conversations about keeping the really good aspects of the illness, not having terrible side effects, but keeping you well. And the kind of the whole ongoing conversation. It's very easy to get in one camp or another, which is, if you're in a hospital, you see the really bad forms of the illness, okay? So you see all the people who've tried to kill themselves, or all the people who are psychotic or have been in jail or have ruined their lives. So those doctors don't want to hear about positive aspects of the illness because they think it just leads people down the primrose path. That's a legitimate concern. I completely understand that on the part of doctors. But you also, patients don't want to hear, here's a brochure and this is what's going to happen. You're going to die if you don't take your medication and you've got a horrible illness, live with it. I mean, somewhere in between there, you got to be able to do it. So I think what we're trying to do is gear that conversation to address the issue of medication adherence. On the other hand, having said that, I again get back to my husband, who's a cardiologist. He says repeatedly to my psychiatric colleagues, you guys drone on about why people don't take medications. Try being a cardiologist, getting people not to smoke, take their statins, exercise, good luck with that. And so it's a problem in any chronic disease. It's not just psychiatry by any stretch.
I have to tell you, we are getting so many amazing questions on the cards. I want to go back to the mics, but some of them are in a theme around different demographics of people facing issues around suicide. Is there anything you can offer with regard to suicides in the LGBT community? Are you seeing anything there that you can comment on, either of you?
I'd say, again, I think there's just infinitely more awareness than there used to be, and not enough. It's not clear that this actual completed suicide rate is so much higher in that community, but the attempted suicide rate is. And certainly one suicide is one too many. And I think that, schools can probably reach out more than they do, and I think, again, the issue of support groups is this is a place where that comes up a lot and can be very important. I do think it's changing. I mean, I think people are just much more sensitive and less judgmental. It's not to say it's not horrible and that there isn't bullying, but that it is better than it used to be. And I'm not the best person to ask. I think you would have to go to somebody in the community itself, I think.
Yeah, and I would just add, we haven't talked a ton about culture, and every culture brings with it its own approach to mental health and suicide prevention, and culture can be defined by your ethnicity, your LGBTQ status, whatever it ends up being. And so part of this is about, as Kay just said, kind of reaching people where they are and speaking their language. And we do see statistics very dependent upon different groups. Latina girls have a high rate of suicide, as do elderly white men, and as do, we know, college, suicide is the second leading cause of death for college students. So depending upon the research, there are a lot of different groups that we need to be reaching more appropriately, and LGBTQ identified individuals are included. There are also, fortunately, a lot of great resources, at least for the LGBTQ community. The Trevor Project is a great one, geared specifically for suicide prevention within the community. So for whomever asked the question, if you're not familiar with the Trevor Project, it's a great place to start.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to go up to mic number 3 now.
Hi, thank you both so much for the talks. I have 2 friends who have admitted suicidal tendencies, and what I hear from the both of them is that their defense for attempting to commit suicide is that people eventually will forget about them and what happened. And to people outside of their mental bubble, it's so obvious that that's not the case, and you can try and hammer it into their heads as much as possible, but they just won't believe it, and nothing you can say or do will get that out of their heads. So what do you do to combat that frame of mind?
I don't know that I have a great answer for your question. I may have to turn it over to Kay, but I will say, for those who are kind of new to the suicide world, one of the things that I've heard time and time again from people who have had serious suicidal thoughts or have attempted and lived, the message is they didn't necessarily want to die, they just needed the pain to end. And this seemed to be the only way for the pain to end. And so part of it is it's difficult for those of us who haven't been in that mindset to quite understand the severity and the gravity. But for suicide loss survivors, and I don't know who in the audience comes from this perspective, it's hard to kind of make sense of all of this. And oftentimes there's that feeling of that anger of why did they do this to me? And in some ways, what I'm hearing from your question is, that's similar of like how can they not understand? Everyone that I've talked to who can figure out how to put it into words, their answer is like, I didn't want to die, I didn't want to do this to people, I just couldn't figure out a way to get out of this isolation and this desolation. So I'm not answering your question. I'm going to turn it over to Kay to do so, but I think it's been enlightening for me as a loss survivor to hear that message, to better understand what was going through Brian's head as well as the minds of the people that we work with.
Yeah, I think from the point of view of, having, after I came out of my coma and so forth, and the questions of, you had so much to live for, which is certainly true, is it's completely irrelevant. I mean, that's the unfortunate thing. It's not rational. And the fact of the matter is that even though I had a great family and life and so forth, my feeling was that my family and friends would be better off without me. I didn't have any doubt about wanting to die. I wanted to die. But I thought that I'd become a burden to everybody. So it's not a question. It's a totally different perspective. Family members, my mother, who was the world's best mother, absolutely loving, could not have been more understanding, kind, wonderful. I mean, I adored her. Couldn't understand. And my feeling was, I just couldn't be such a burden to you. I knew how stressed out I was making you, I mean, it's just it's two different worlds. It's two totally different experiences.
Can I just add also one thing, which again doesn't answer the question, but I think is also important. There is a fear that by asking about suicide, you're going to put the idea in somebody's mind. And actually, and Dr. Jamison said this earlier, the absolute best thing that you can do for somebody that you think might be thinking about suicide is to ask. You will not be putting the idea in their head, and instead you're opening up a door and an opportunity for them to say yes. And if they say yes, you keep them safe and you call 911 right away. But you're never going to put the idea in somebody's mind by asking. And again, this goes a little bit to the very beginning of this conversation of we're afraid to talk about this stuff, so we don't. We've got to talk about it. And if there's somebody in your life that you're worried about that you think might be thinking about suicide, ask them, are you thinking about suicide? And be prepared for the answer. And that can be really hard, but at least that way you're giving them the opportunity to give you an answer, and you get help and support for yourself to get through that situation.
Thank you. From the question card, Dr. Jamison, in my research on school violence, a diagnosis of personality disorder seems prescribed. Your thoughts on this disorder?
A personality disorder in general, I mean, in the diagnostic criteria that are used in making a psychiatric diagnosis, there is what's known as Axis 1, which are the major psychiatric disorders like major depression, the anxiety disorders, schizophrenia, bipolar illness, and so forth. And then there's what's called this Axis 2, which generally refers to a series of disorders, personality disorders that are characterized at their core by a disregard for the rights and a lack of empathy, lack of regard for the rights of other people, a sense of being above the law. So sociopathic personality disorder, sociopathy, some version of that, narcissistic personality disorder, borderline personality disorder, where you may have different symptoms that come and go in terms of mood and in terms of aggression, but the central notion is of, quote, character, which is kind of a vaguely puritanical Protestant view of psychiatric illness, but it's that would be the general notion. So when you say personality disorder, you're talking about something slightly different.
Okay. There is clearly a hunger in this community to have a conversation on the topic of mental health and suicide. I can take one more question, and I'm going to go to mic number 1, and then I want to give our speakers an opportunity to give some final words.
Thank you. At what age do you think it is appropriate to have these discussions on mental health and suicide? And how do we best speak to our children and youth in the community on that topic? What's the best forum for those types of discussions?
I'll give you the non-clinical answer. I'm a mom. I'm a mom of 3 young kids. My oldest is 7 and my youngest is 2. And I was talking with my kids about it this weekend. We talk about Uncle Brian. And my kids haven't heard the word suicide, but my 7-year-old wants to know why Uncle Brian isn't around anymore. And I shared with her that Uncle Brian died because he was really he had an illness in his brain and he had an illness in his mind. And that's the extent of where we've gone. I think one of the challenges is we tend to want to talk about suicide when we get to crisis. And in fact, and Dr. Jamison brought this up before in the slide about all sorts like cardiovascular disease. We don't start talking about heart attacks when somebody has a heart attack. We start talking about heart health and eating well and sleeping well and taking care of yourself and signs of when you should take aspirin, when you should go to the doctor, and then the defib, et cetera. We need to be talking about this stuff very early on. We need to be talking to kindergartners about feeling sad and having sad days and having bad days. And we need to talk to kindergartners, we need to talk to preschoolers about bullying and buddying, as my 5-year-old will tell me. And we need to use the words depression and bipolar disorder and suicide for high school students. After Brian died, I reflected on my time. We had a health class in my senior year of high school where we had no mention of mental health. The very first time I heard the word suicide was the time I got a phone call from my mom telling me that Brian had taken his life. And that is way too late. And so we don't always need to be using the clinical words for a 5-year-old. That doesn't make any sense. That's not necessary. But I think kids need to be given a vehicle to be able to express their emotions and express their sadness. I also would say that the absolute best thing that you can do as a parent is to model. When you're having a bad day, be open about that. Let your kids know that you have bad days, or maybe you have depression or bipolar disorder, and even though you are the person that they look up to, you also aren't happy-go-lucky every single day, or you live with a mental illness during this. The moment that I start sharing my vulnerabilities with my kids, I see this light bulb of like, oh, mom too? Which can carry them, I haven't yet gotten to teenage girl stage or prepubescent girl stage, which I'm dreading, but when it gets that for them, they'll have an opportunity to know that while mom might seem like a hero sometimes, like mom really struggles other times too. And so use the words that are comfortable to you. I would say give kids, whether they be in your classroom or in your home, the opportunity to actually say they're not doing well. And when they cry, don't say stop crying, but say, hey, what are you crying about? Can we work it through? Let emotions happen so that when we get to a stage where we're talking clinical depression, bipolar disorder, whatever it may be, it's not this brand new thing that all of a sudden has entered our world and we don't know how to handle it.
I think it's absolutely wonderfully true. But I think that one place, well, I suppose 2 places. One thing I would say is education through one of the things that one of my colleagues, Dr. Karen Schwartz at Hopkins, does is she started a program in the private schools and public schools of Baltimore, and it's now across the country, of just going into middle schools and high schools and teaching kids, parents, and teachers, all three groups, about the symptoms of depression and that depression is treatable. Really simple curriculum, videos and education, but the idea is that if somebody's not currently depressed, they're very likely to have one of their friends or themselves be depressed. So education goes a long way, actually. There's enough known that people can learn about it. And parents, I'm always struck by the fact that parents learn about these mondo bizarro diseases that 1 person in a trillion gets, and they don't learn about depression, which is what's likely to kill their kid. And so that leads to one practical suggestion. If you haven't talked to your kids about having a family history of mania, depression, substance abuse, before they go off to college, for sure talk to them before they go to college, because it is a high-risk age, and it's important to line up your ducks in a row and say, look, the odds are, look, we've got bipolar illness in our family. The odds are you're not going to get it, but you might, or you might feel concerned about it. Always talk to me about it and talk to somebody about it. But here's a list of specialists, because if you get somebody who doesn't know what he or she is doing, they can do really bad things to your brain, and that's just simply true. I mean, student health facilities vary enormously in quality, and if you get somebody who has a bipolar genetic loading and they get a certain kind of antidepressant, they can get manic, they can get all agitated and perturbed states, and it can be difficult. So you want to plan in advance. You don't want an emergency to happen to do your planning. You want to be thinking, you know, giving people, your kids, something to learn about it. I mean, I just think that being proactive is, if you're a school system and a health system, being proactive about education. If you're a family, to just be proactive in discussions.
Okay, I am sad to have to bring the evening to an end. There is a big pile of questions here that we're going to do something with. I don't know what. I will review these questions with some students on campus and see if we can create a private page and maybe get some answers. I want to thank our speakers so much for starting a very important conversation and continuing a conversation. Can we thank them together as an audience? Up on our screen here, we have the email address for the Critical Conversations program. If you want to communicate with us in any way, please do so, and I will see if there is some way we can creatively get answers to these many, many fine questions we have here. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. It means a lot to us, and we hope to continue the conversation with you as well. Thank you.